Welcome back. I'm Max Bergman, director of the Stewart Center and Europe-Russia-Eurasia program at CSIS.
And I'm Maria Snegovaya, senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia.
And you're listening to Russian Roulette, a podcast discussing all things Russia and Eurasia from the Center for Strategic International Studies. Hello, and welcome back to Russian Roulette. I'm Max Bergman, back with my co-host Maria Snegovaya, and we're coming at you today with our takes on the recent diplomatic efforts to end the war in Ukraine. This month, we saw President Trump meet with President Putin in Anchorage, Alaska for a high-profile summit. We then saw President Zelenskyy travel to the White House along with a number of his European counterparts and friends to meet with President Trump and make sure Ukraine's future was not decided without Ukrainian input. Today, Maria and I will give you our own quick-fire take of all this high-wire diplomacy and try to figure out where things might be headed from here. So, Maria, thank you for joining your podcast with me.
Thanks for having me, Max.
I'm just back from vacation, so I'm still sort of bleary-eyed, in which, Trump had to sort of ruin by trying to have high-profile diplomacy to negotiate an end to this war. What do you think of the summit with President Putin in Alaska? What was your take on what came of what was kind of a bizarre but interesting summit that, took place? Not unusual for American and Russian leaders to meet, maybe on U.S. soil was sort of unique. But what was your reaction to it? What do you think came out from it?
Absolutely. And I got a little bit lucky with my vacation schedule since I managed to do it right before. So I'm a little bit in the Groundhog Day scenario where I think we're around three or four of the U.S. government attempting to push forward these peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. Just a reminder to our audiences that the whole escalation of the negotiating process started about a week and a half ago with Steve Witkoff going to Moscow meeting Putin. And at that meeting, in the Kremlin, he allegedly got an idea, a perception that the Kremlin was willing to make some territorial concessions, shifting away from its previous claims, demands for basically 4 regions of Ukraine to mainly Donbass, the rest of Donbass, of which, just a reminder to our audiences, Ukraine still controls about 25%, and also allegedly certain flexibility on security guarantees on the Russian side. That prompted preparation of the Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska last week, which we all watched on air last Friday. So the interesting thing about the Alaska is I think that many observers have interpreted that indeed as Putin's win for several reasons. First of all, Putin gets out of the diplomatic isolation, right? Just a reminder that last time he met the US president was before he started this horrible war, notoriously like that meeting with Biden, which was also now highly criticized for Biden meeting Putin, but it's been quite some time since then, and it didn't seem like Putin sort of deserved the meeting, given that Russia has continued horrible attacks and strikes on Ukraine. As we speak, in fact, the intensity of those attacks intensified since Trump took office, almost doubled. Another potential win for Putin, other than him getting out of the diplomatic isolation, also the fact that Trump very notably shifted in his demands away from his insistence on immediate ceasefire, which was his main talking point since March this year for several months. Suddenly, after a couple of hours talking to Putin, he now shifts basically to embrace the Kremlin talking point that we are not going to implement immediate ceasefire. In fact, we're going to address the long-term, basically try to negotiate long-term settlement, long-term agreement. But that, of course, allows Putin to just continue pushing further in Ukraine as this all happens, and therefore sort of pushes the U.S. administration away from the regional, more pro-Ukrainian position. But most importantly, I also do not understand why did we see this meeting so dramatically being cut short. Just a reminder that Putin brought with him quite a significant delegation of ministers, including Minister of Finance, which many assumed that there will be some economic negotiations between both sides, perhaps some economic deals. None of that happened. The luncheon that they planned was also canceled, and Putin essentially flew back home. So that also was interpreted by many observers as not a successful meeting. And yet here we are with basically shifting White House position on Ukraine. on the immediate ceasefire towards long-term negotiation. So basically, a lot of mixed signals. But the good news is that this Monday we've seen that the European leadership and Ukrainian President Zelenskyy have been able similarly to also like push forward their agenda with Trump by insisting on U.S. providing security guarantees. And it seems that Trump confirmed continuous weapon sales to Ukraine, even if through NATO allies. So a lot of sort of mixed signaling. It's really not clear to me if we moved in any way away from the original point where we've been. So I wonder what your take on that is, given that's my perception.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was first sort of a stunning visual to roll out the red carpet to the Russian president who's wanted by The Hague. Literally, U.S. forces rolling out the red carpet, on their knees, as Putin arrived. And then Trump sort of clapping for Putin. It struck me, being an old man now in Washington, remembering the Barack Obama era when he gently bowed to the Japanese prime minister, and it caused huge uproar of how he diminished the United States. And here was Trump sort of clapping for Vladimir Putin. So, that was pretty stunning. I think, what's difficult about this is I find in some ways easier to sort of ascertain the logic behind what Putin is after than trying to ascertain what Donald Trump and the United States is after. And I mean, I do think that what Trump was hoping to do was sort of by rolling out the red carpet to Putin, by clapping and trying to create a bromance. Maybe that's something Trump has always wanted to do with Putin anyways, but that, we can be friends. And like, look, if we're friends, then look here, I got my Treasury Secretary, my Commerce Secretary, we can do all these great deals. We just got to deal with this little, Ukraine land issue. And so I think maybe he was hoping to entice Putin with the potential for a broader U.S.-Russia relationship if he could just settle this minor squabble in Ukraine and in the Donbass. And that just wasn't, I think, going to work. I think it then probably becomes apparent to Trump and other U.S. officials that this isn't going to work. So then I guess why have the lunch? I'm a little, that got canceled. I mean, we never got a clear readout of what happened internally. It's pretty clear that it's not like the relationship is over between Trump and Putin. Trump had a 40-minute call with Putin when Zelenskyy was here with the European leaders as well, where he took a timeout to have that call. So in general, it strikes me as the United States has not quite understood this conflict and what Vladimir Putin is after, and has sort of gone at this in a very haphazard, slapdash way that, was, I think, transparently not going to lead to very much. And so what we have is a diplomatic ping pong where it's in the interest of both sides, of Russia and Ukraine, to just keep hitting the ball back and forth. And you're just sort of hoping that the other side kind of messes up in the eyes of Trump and comes and drops the hammer on the other one. And Russia was probably feeling very good about themselves back in February. Ukraine and the Europeans, I think, have done a lot of work to try to rebuild themselves in the eyes of Trump. But in general, I just think this ping pong is going to continue to go on for a while. And, the ball's now in Ukraine's court earlier this week. Now it looks like it's been hit back to Russia. And now we're in this sort of confused place. So I don't really think we're anywhere different than we were, before this all ruined my vacation or threatened to ruin my vacation. But, I'm curious what you think, and what has the Russian reaction been? You track Russian, press and reporting and other things. How are they talking about this?
Yeah, well, Russians always making the point that I think is very interesting to flag how much they appreciate the U.S. effort and Donald Trump's effort in particular, to hear them, right, to reflect on the point.
Europeans are doing exactly the same
I think
thing.
every
European leader surrounding Trump was like, "Thank you, Mr. President, for
we so much appreciate your effort."
Yeah.
So I think at this point, the playbook of dealing with Donald Trump is quite straightforward to both parties, and it's not only Putin's unique wisdom, as to how to tackle this issue. But the real problem, though, I think, in the broader terms, is what is this seeming malleability, openness, Trump's openness, right, to accept the talking points by both parties, depending on who he meets with last. What does it really mean for Ukraine going forward? Is that bad news, or is it just, just part of the status quo? You just learn to manage it. But on Russia's side, absolutely somewhat ironic situation happened to Vladimir Solovyov, this notorious propagandist, who, while he constantly praises Trump, just discovered that the Ukraine delegation very aptly handed Trump a list of his quote deriding the US president. And he is now trying to defend himself, saying that it's not what I meant, these horrible Ukrainians just, misinterpreted everything. And I think that is basically reflective of the broader position that many in Russia are taking these days, trying to make sure that they communicate that they're very grateful to Trump while without really conceding any of the positions. Also, how much Russia has shifted sort of depends on who you listen to, right? If you listen to Steve Witkoff or President Trump or even Marco Rubio in some ways, when they communicate Russian position, it appears that the shift is much more pronounced than when we actually listen to Russian officials. Putin has been sort of so far not very outspoken on the topic, but Foreign Minister Lavrov has repeatedly basically stated many of the same points we've heard before. There is no even confirmation that there's actually a meeting between Putin and Zelenskyy in the making on the Russian side. The Russian side only confirmed that there's elevation of the level of the meeting, but there's no actual confirmation that it's going to be Putin who meets with Zelenskyy. So that even that is in question, even if from the American side we keep hearing that the meeting is being planned and there's even a place allegedly selected, Hungary, Budapest specifically, which also unfortunately drives a lot of bad flashbacks associated to Budapest Memorandum, which is a separate story. Also, notably, Lavrov, in the way he talks about what actually has been discussed, and specifically the security guarantees, flags that they cannot be worked out without Russia's participation, which effectively means that Russia will have some veto over those security guarantees, which effectively means that we're going back to Istanbul 2022 agreements. That is, again, back to the good old status quo, or not so good old status quo we've already been. So that, if you listen to Foreign Minister Lavrov, there hasn't really been much change in Russia's position. So in a lot of ways, I agree with you, Max, that despite all the talk and all the noise, substantively, we haven't really seen Russia shifting much away from its original position, short of perhaps this insistence on now only swapping like territories of Donetsk primarily. Even there, however, I think it should be kept in mind that the remaining of the Donetsk region that is currently controlled by Ukraine, about a quarter of its territory, is highly strategically important because from logistical and military perspective, it controls several important logistic infrastructural nodes that potentially to Russia open up easy access to Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkiv regions if transferred to Russia. So again, when we think about Russia's willing to negotiate and allegedly make some territorial concessions, it's also important to keep in mind that it's potentially gaining a leverage and easier access to other regions of Ukraine going forward.
Yeah, and, I think Putin's opening gambit was that Ukraine should give Russia territory that it doesn't currently possess, which, was never going to it's something the Ukrainians were never going to agree to. In some ways, it's a poison pill offer. And look, I think the big outcome here actually this week with the Zelenskyy meeting and with the Europeans showing up is that Ukraine is not alone. And there was a lot of teeth gnashing that we covered extensively on our sister podcast, The Europhile. Please subscribe. About how the Europeans didn't have a seat at the table when Trump first tried to initiate negotiations back earlier this year. The Europeans felt sidelined, and in some ways, the Europeans, deserve to be sidelined. They hadn't, insisted on having a seat at the table. They weren't organized enough, and their aid was not as substantial as the U.S. But what we've seen actually over the last few months is that the Europeans have really committed to Ukraine. When they're at the NATO summit, they agreed to increase defense spending significantly. We will see how much of that comes to fruition, but there's an important element there that they can count aid to Ukraine as part of their defense spending, so that incentivized that. When Mark Rutte came to the White House in July, the Europeans agreed to do something that a year ago I would have said there's no way they're going to agree to do this, which is to essentially buy American aid, that the Europeans are buying weapons from the U.S. to then give to Ukraine, as opposed to the United States just giving weapons to Ukraine. So that in some ways enables U.S. aid to continue to Ukraine. It's just the Europeans are the ones paying for it. They're willing to do that because they recognize the importance to European security. And, so all of this adds up to actually Europe is transitioning to become Ukraine's most important backer, not in this war, and it's not the United States. And I think that's only going to continue as we enter into 2026. And so the Europeans have sort of earned their seat at the table, and they came to this White House meeting because they didn't want Zelenskyy to be bullied by Trump. And it's unclear to me what they would have done. I'm not sure Keir Starmer would have, ripped up the special relationship right in front of Donald Trump if JD Vance had started yelling at Zelenskyy again. But I do think that collectively, Macron and Merz were ready to do that, as well as, von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission. So Ukraine now has, a strong backer in Europe collectively, which has 450 million people, an economy the size of the United States, the capability to really continue Ukraine's war effort. So I think that is sort of the big shift. And that will be something that I think Moscow picked up on, but that wasn't instigated by U.S. peacemaking efforts. That was instigated because
I'd say it was an externality.
Yeah, it was an externality. It was, this was a positive outcome of what happened this week, but that wasn't Donald Trump's intention here, I think.
And if anything, perhaps less even in some ways in line with his general policies, having Europe, if anything, more allied and more independent, more. Even I think there's a lot of questions to how, like, the pictures that we've seen from the White House do not really signal immediate European independence, but certainly more commitment to Ukraine. I think certainly something on the European allies that we see right now. And by the way, I do see Europe getting a lot of, bad commentary, weakness, lack of resolution and whatnot. But comparatively speaking, from historical perspective, the way we see the European allies standing up for Ukraine compared to, for example, what we've seen after the Second World War, right, when effectively Stalin was able to subordinate all of the much of the Central Eastern Europe without any resistance coming from the West, I think is very, very pronounced. And I flag one more thing: it's kind of ironic to see now Europe, including like President Macron, who just gave the very eloquent interview flagging that Russia is a long-term danger, that one should not be trusting Putin and whatnot. So Europe becoming much more hawkish on Russia, while the United States are becoming much more dovish in some weird, 180 degrees turnaround from what we've seen before.
I certainly agree. And I think what has happened more generally is that the U.S. doesn't have that much leverage over either party, actually. In this war. We had more, I think, leverage over Ukraine back in February than we do now because the Europeans are willing to buy U.S. aid. Ukraine has taken steps to increase its quote-unquote strategic autonomy, I think, from the United States. And over Russia, if President Trump is not going to increase American arms transfers to Ukraine, and all he's really doing is trying to entice Russia into economic deals, that's not a lot of leverage. The one area, and I'll throw this back to you, where we have seen some real movement from the Trump administration, hasn't really resulted in anything yet, is going after India, I guess with the pretext of India buying Russian oil. It's part of the whole larger fight over trade deals. But India now has some of the highest tariffs of any country. This does not appear to be working to get India to reduce its purchases of Russian oil. It right now just seems to be making India really mad at the United States and destroying the U.S.-India relationship. But do you think that there's something there here? Have you seen any other action on the U.S. really starting to go after Russian oil? Because that appears the one area where Trump has been signaling that he might be willing to go after Russia economically. And as we've noted on this podcast, there aren't a lot that the U.S. can do, but going after Russian oil is one thing that we could certainly do.
Yeah, I think that at the very least, it's a very welcome development, even if at least some signal that we've got from the United States finally willing to get a little bit tougher on the Kremlin, that was long overdue, in my opinion. It's important to keep in mind that, first of all, the penalties and tariffs itself is actually not going to take place until later. However, we did see some promising early forecasts showcasing that the Russian crude exports to India plunged threefold, allegedly, after these tariffs were announced just yesterday. However, already today we got the news that In fact, India's state-run refineries increased their Russian oil buying despite criticism coming from the United States. So a lot of mixed signals. I think that in general, the fact that the US administration is willing to rhetorically get tougher on Russia, that is a welcome development that we haven't seen before, by the way. Remember how Donald Trump has been consistently criticized for his very favorable rhetoric towards Putin. That has been changing over the last months, along with this announcement of the tariffs that are coming. Hopefully, still that is good. I will also flag that for all the questionable commitment of the U.S. for continuation of these weapon supplies to Ukraine and whatnot. So far, the weapons, at least the one left over from the Biden administration package, have been coming. The intel has been coming. While this is definitely not enough for Ukraine to win, it's at least somewhat enough to sustain this fragile status quo, curdle Russia's advances. Russia has tried to implement an impressive breakthrough on the battlefield at the time of the Alaska meeting, but it failed because Ukraine army was actually able ultimately to curdle its advances. So altogether, we see that this administration, even if unwillingly and sort of reluctantly, continuing the previous track. And as you flagged, Max, now we have a somewhat clear path forward with the European allies basically purchasing the weapons for Ukraine. And while I will flag that I don't think Europe is fully autonomous here, this is where I slightly disagree with you, because the weapons are still provided by the United States. So the discretion to, provide those weapons still is decision of the White House. Nonetheless, I think indeed we have somewhat a clear path forward for Ukraine. It's not ideal. It's not the first choice, but also it's not abysmal. And from that perspective, that is still a good outcome for Ukraine.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. The White House could cut off arms sales to Ukraine. It could stop selling weapons to Europe that Europe intends to transfer to Ukraine, or it could sell those weapons to Europe but prevent them from being transferred to Ukraine. But that would also send a signal that the United States is not a reliable arms sales partner, which would hurt U.S. global arms sales. But the worst case outcome, which looked like it was going to happen back in February, of sort of a total cutoff Ukraine, hasn't happened. But, as we look going forward, there's a lot of discussion right now about security guarantees, and we have just a few minutes left. But to me, the security guarantees question is really putting the cart way, way, way before the horse. And I find the whole idea of a bunch of Europeans in Ukraine, so Brits and French and other troops in Ukraine, but not backed up by the United States, which there's no way they would be, because then effectively Ukraine is in NATO. And so you would just have Europeans there in Ukraine. That is Putin's nightmare. That is like NATO in Ukraine. And why wouldn't he shoot at them? I mean, that's just sort of, I think in some ways, it would be triggering something that if you put in UK or French forces or pan-European forces on the ground in Ukraine, first of all, I don't think there's any way Putin would ever accept that unless the war has completely gone awry for him. And secondly, I think if he did accept that, I think Europeans should get very nervous, because I don't see how the U.S. provides a quote-unquote backstop, i.e. comes to Europe's defense to fight the Russians if they're shot at. And so therefore might be something that Putin wants, because it's a way of fighting NATO without actually having to fight NATO. So I think we're getting the whole security guarantee discussion is a little bit getting out in front of ourselves. But I think there's a lot of diplomacy left. It seems like there's supposed to be talks ongoing. But to me, it looks like this war is just going to continue. And it's only going to continue. It's only really going to come to an end when Russia figures out that it cannot win. And right now, there doesn't appear that Vladimir Putin sees it that way.
And we know from our War Economy reports, but that we just recently released, that unfortunately Russia still has the economic resources, even if that's shrinking, to keep fighting. Max, if I can just add quick one point
Please.
To everything that you said, and I fully agree. While it seems that the Trump has now been open to providing some security guarantees, including possibly air power to European alleged peace forces on the ground, like again, we are really miles away from Putin accepting that, because that certainly effectively defeats all of his original goals. One particular point that's been flagged, and I agree, is that remember how the war started with Putin demanding security guarantees for Russia. But all we're discussing right now are actually security guarantees for Ukraine. And in that sense, at least rhetorically, I think it's a victory for Ukraine, given that ultimately, in the broader sense, I think, from the global perspective, Putin's original goals are already unattainable. I don't think he's ever going to get the security guarantees that he envisioned when he started it. Having said that, unfortunately, the cost to pay for him to realize it and finally be convinced about it, I think, is yet to be fully paid by Ukraine, and that's unfortunate. The unfortunate, horrible reality.
Yeah, and maybe last thought from me is I think the big fear for Ukraine is that an endless war, obviously not at this current rate of carnage, but if there is just sort of fighting the way that Ukraine and Russia were fighting, from 2014 to 2021, for Russia, I think that's totally fine and sustainable, but it leaves Ukraine utterly stuck. So this is the challenge, is that while I think Ukraine is not the obstacle to peace, to a ceasefire, to any sort of deal, the only way to really bring Russia to the table, in my eyes, is they have to really want out of this war. And right now, I think they have a strategic interest for it to continue. Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to leave it there. This was our quick, rapid reaction show to all the events that happened over the last week. As usual, thanks to our great listeners for tuning in. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to our show and give us a 5-star rating. Additionally, we hope to have a new report out coming soon called Guns and Oil, Continuity and Change in Russia-India Relations. We touched on it a bit in this episode, but we'll talk about it more in future episodes, the Russia-India relationship, one that is, I think, going to be incredibly important over the next year. So please check out that report. It will be available soon at csis.org. Additionally, as I already plugged, please check out our sister podcast, The Europhile, wherever you get your podcasts. We hope you enjoyed your summer and hope you enjoy the last few weeks of the summer, and we will see you next time on Russian Roulette.
You've been listening to Russian Roulette. We hope you enjoyed this episode and tune in again soon.
Russian Roulette releases new episodes every 2 weeks on Thursdays and is available wherever you get your podcasts. So please subscribe and share our episodes online.
And be sure to check out all the latest analysis by the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at csis.org.